You'll soon meet Dr. James Webb, a licensed psychologist and a board-certified diplomate in clinical psychology, and highly regarded here in the United States as well as overseas, using the frequent keynote and workshop speaker at state and expert on radio as well as on televised news, cited as an expert in a number of wide newspapers and magazines. So understanding of the unique, sensitive, emotional 1,000 copies and has been translated into several languages. Dr. Webb has also written over 60 professional publications, 8 other books, and many research papers for psychology conventions or conferences regarding gifted and talented children. In 1981, Dr. Webb established SANG, which stands for Supporting Emotional Needs of Gifted Children. He is still the organization's co-director. SANG provides information and holds national workshops and conferences. Until 1995, Dr. Webb was professor and associate dean at Wright State University's School of Professional Psychology in Dayton, Ohio. We hope you will enjoy the seminar, and if you'd like to learn more about Dr. Webb, his writings, or his programs, there will be contact information at the end of the video. Now, here's Dr. James Webb.
So often, parents of gifted children have told me that they've got notification from the school that their child has been identified for the gifted program and is now in the ACE program or the PACE program or the SNAG program or whatever. That's a real one, by the way, supporting and nurturing academically gifted. We have these wonderful acronyms. But they got notification their child has been identified as gifted, but they really never got the characteristics of what did the school look for, or what is it that is about my child, made my child be considered gifted. Actually, that's only part of telling the teachers earlier today. I told them that what I was going to do, parents, is that you're my most favorite group to talk to. You're my most favorite group, not that I don't like teachers. I mean, they behave, they clean up well, they're generally okay people, but I prefer talking to parents of gifted children. The reason is because over the last 20 or so years I've been in this field, I have just become so impressed with the simple fact that parenting is more important in the long-term outcome of gifted children than is teaching. Now, not that teaching's unimportant. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that so many times I have seen where parents understood, guided, could nurture, support gifted children, good parenting like that could regularly overcome mediocre, poor, or even really awful teaching. But the reverse just isn't so. That is, teaching almost no matter how good it is can seldom overcome mediocre, poor, or awful parenting. Do you know what I'm saying? But the irony of this is the parents have repeatedly told me how often they felt out of the loop. Very little information. Part of why I want to go over the characteristics with you. Parents repeatedly tell me that they have this child, that they think their child's unusual and bright, but then they try to share experiences with other parents who say, every mother thinks she has a gifted child, you know. Or, why are you putting so much pressure on your child? Forcing your child to learn how to read at age 3 or 4 is just stressful, and so forth. Or, why do you let your child ask such impertinent questions all the time? Or, what do you mean your child only needs 5 hours sleep a night? Don't you know every good parent makes sure their child gets 8 solid hours sleep a night? And by the way, I said that very purposely because that's one of the best kept secrets around that parents nor teachers know about. There's about 20% of gifted children that simply need less sleep than other kids. No one tells them, but these kids get by at age 4, 5, 6 on 4, 5, 6 hours sleep a night. Their poor parents need 18, 20 hours sleep a night. And they get in these incredible power struggles. You know, go to sleep, but I'm not tired. I'm tired, go to sleep. But I also, though, have to do a Paul Harvey here and tell you the rest of the story. And the Paul Harvey is about 20% of gifted children need less sleep, but 20% need significantly more sleep than other kids. And I'll say a little bit more about that later.
Is that any different for non-people?
The question was, would that be any different for non-gifted? It does seem to be disproportionately as you go up the intellectual spectrum. And the more highly gifted, the more likely you are to find that pattern. And it does tend to carry over into adulthood. Let me go over these characteristics. These are not my characteristics. These are ones that I have stolen from textbooks going back over the last 15, 20 or more years. You know, there's an old saying in academia, if you steal from one person, it's called plagiarism. If you steal from two or more, it's called research. So this simply represents research that I have done. And these characteristics are ones that if you pick up any book going back 20 or 30 years, you'll find these are repeated time and again. Yes, these are the characteristics that most gifted children show most of the time. And it will allow you as parents to compare your experiences with what the experts have agreed for years. Yes, most gifted kids show these characteristics. Unusually large vocabularies. Most gifted children start speaking earlier than other kids. Now, most, but not all. Some actually start speaking later. But when they start speaking, it's in paragraphs and essays. Very typically. They speak in complex sentence structures. They comprehend language nuances, the fine meanings of words. Longer attention span and persistence in what they're interested in, not what you and I think they ought to be interested in. And that's a very important point to keep in mind in a couple of ways. First of all is with regard to motivation. A lot of people say, parents and teachers say, I have an unmotivated gifted child. And I usually tell them, you know, I've almost never seen an unmotivated gifted child. I've seen lots of gifted kids that were motivated in areas I didn't care a fig for, but they weren't unmotivated. They do have this attention span persistence in their area of interest. Intensity of feelings and actions. This, folks, is probably the single most universal, most open characteristic of gifted kids is intensity. It's like one mother, she said, my child seems to be anything worth doing is worth doing to excess. And these do tend to be excessive personalities. Whatever they're into excessively. Quarks and black holes, that's all they want. Dinosaurs, they eat, sleep, breathe, live them. Chess, that's all. Power struggles, equally as intensely. And actually, there also. Gifted kids, whether they need less sleep or more sleep, tend to sleep more intensely than other kids. In the sense that they're more difficult to rouse, are more likely to be in color. Now, I know some of you thought everyone dreams in color. No, they're prone to sleepwalking and bedwetting. Apparently because that's my hunch. Yeah. But that intensity you're going to see cutting across everything else, and we'll talk later. Wide range of interest. Now, but not universal. There are some kids that are born just with tunnel vision. Harold Brazilian brown spiders, and the good Lord intended anyone should know about Brazilian brown spiders. But that's all he wants to know about. And he's been that way since as far back as I can remember. Now, that's one pattern that you see in some gifted kids, that tunnel vision. But frankly, the more typical pattern is one that I call the grasshopper pattern. The kind of youngster who jumps from leaf to leaf to leaf. But whatever leaf he's on, he is as intensely involved in as the leaf before until he jumps to the next leaf. It's why I tell parents often, rent the clarinet, don't buy it. Because the interest typically will change, and the wide range of interest actually foreshadows. On the one hand, it's a strength of these kids. It's wonderful. But on the other hand, it foreshadows a problem that we see later in middle school, high school, and beyond, the problem of multipotentiality. So many potentials in so many areas that it becomes extraordinarily difficult to decide, to make choices about what you're going to do, including college majors, or actually even beyond college in terms of occupations. Now, this tunnel vision versus the grasshopper has a very puzzling phenomenon for us, for many of us in the field for years. But there's a theory in the last 5 or 10 years that is helping us make a lot of sense out of what we're seeing, out of this pattern and out of the intensity. And it's one that I'd like for you to know about, because my prediction is you're going to see a lot more, hear a lot more about this theory. It's called Dabrowski theory. A Polish psychologist named Kazimierz Dabrowski, who's now dead, some years ago, in working with creative adults and going back looking at their childhood, came up with a theory that is now referred to as the Dabrowski theory of the overexcitabilities. The overexcitabilities. And it really helps us make sense out of some of these patterns. Part of what Dabrowski did was he simply took some stuff that we already knew, in the sense that looking back at infants, he noted, as we have for years, that when they're born, these babies are sponges for information. They absorb it. They're just sucking in information. They're excited by the stimuli around them. We've known that. But then, working with these brighter, more creative adults and looking at their childhood, what he noticed was that the overall brighter you are, that level of excitability increases, such that it becomes an over-excitability, what I called intensity. Intensity in the sense that it's like a tropism, an inborn predisposition to be attracted to and stimulated by stimuli. And Dabrowski noted that this was true, but not necessarily equally in all areas, that there were kids who were born with that. And so we see kids now who, here we have Maria, and Maria, it's numbers for her. Oh, 7, what a gorgeous number. 5 is pedestrian. Suzanne, it's music. She can taste music. She feels. And then we have Harriet here, and Harriet, it's a sensual overexcitability in the sense that she's a sort of kid, and many of you have kids like this, she's a sort of kid that you have to cut the tags out of the back of their shirts. I know some of you think I've been peeking in your windows now, but they can't wear nubby socks, or wool itches, or they hear fluorescent lights. Who can hear fluorescent lights? Well, apparently they do, some of these kids, if they are in that kind of an overexcitability. Now, most gifted kids, and this we're talking, the overall brighter you get, essentially the more the overexcitability. And in most gifted kids, it's in several areas, but there are some where it's only in 1 or 2 areas, which has then led to another theory that you're going to run into if you haven't already. And that is the theory of asynchronous development. You'd think that a psychologist made up that term, wouldn't you? But it actually was made up by parents. That's interesting, little aside. Asynchronous development. But it's a very important concept, because what they noticed was that gifted kids in their development aren't equally developed smoothly in all areas. That you've, in fact, as intellect goes up, you find a greater disparity in abilities, and frankly, some people are talking about even a higher incidence of learning disabilities amongst gifted kids, where you can be gifted and LD, despite what some school systems have as an unwritten policy of 1 label per customer. You know, you can be either gifted or LD, but you can't be both. Apparently, you can. Okay. So the intensity, the wide range of interests, a strong curiosity, limitless questions, particularly preschoolers. Mothers of preschoolers tell me at the end of the day their ears are just tired from the questions. Gifted kids love to experiment. They like to put things together, or more often take things apart, in unusual ways, particularly if they're the sort of gifted child who is into divergent thinking, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. They learn basic skills more quickly and with less practice. Matter of fact, the most gifted children teach themselves how to read and write before entering school. And I'm saying this to you parents knowing that a goodly number of you will have experienced what I call a bad rap. The bad rap being, Mrs. Johansson, I really wish you hadn't put so much pressure on your child. And the parents say, I don't think I did. I mean, I let him watch Sesame Street and answered a few questions. And what I'm saying is I really have come to believe you as parents, that there are relatively gifted kids who have been doing 6 and 8 hours worth of homework at the Better Baby Institute. You know, there are a few. Remember, you don't have to look up telephone numbers anymore. You ask your 8-year-old, tell you folks, but an unusual sense of humor, particularly puns. I often tell people that I have come to consider puns a hard diagnostic sign of gifted if you see it in a youngster under the age of about 8 or 10. And if you think about that for a minute, it makes sense, doesn't it? It takes a certain amount of smarts and mental flexibility to do those double entendres. Now, these characteristics that I've gone over with you are the ones that you'll see in all those textbooks. But there are two that you're unlikely to see, or less likely, because they deal with younger gifted children. And as many of you may know, up until fairly recently, our educational systems only identified and began serving gifted children along about 2nd or 3rd grade, that is, age 8 or 9. Okay? These two characteristics apply to gifted children younger than that. The first of these is gifted children in kindergarten, 1st and 2nd grade love to organize people and things. But this usually in games that they invent. But are they simple games? No. They have rules within rules within rules and then exceptions to rules. And then they try and organize. The first, we don't even understand the game, much less the rules. And then the last one is one that is characteristic of about half to 3/4 of gifted preschoolers, and that is imaginary playmates. Parents tell me they worry a lot about this. Am I not providing enough stimulation for my child? Is that why she had to create these imaginary playmates? Is it a sign of mental illness? As long as your child can give and receive affection, now that's the key, that's important. But as long as your child can do that and has imaginary playmates, the research is really clear that imaginary playmates in that age range is associated only with brightness and creativity. So you can relax, try not to be too embarrassed by having to set that extra place at the table or holding the door open for the imaginary playmate, and know that imaginary playmates almost always disappear upon birth of a sibling or upon entering school. Now, I also do have to tell you that imaginary playmates at age 28 or 30 means, so that's a different. If you have to buckle the seatbelt or go back to get some imaginary play left, yes, or particularly, sometimes I've had parents tell me about the imaginary child who had imaginary pets for the imaginary playmate. What I'm hearing here is from other parents who I think know what we're talking about and what you're experiencing, right? This is why I wanted to go over this with you, because I can look out and I can see many of you giving a collective sigh of relief of, oh, I didn't know that this came along with being a gifted child. So having said this about the characteristics, I want to take a little side trip here on something that has made a major impact in the field of education. It's also made a major impact in business and industry, in marriage and family counseling, and in other areas. It's called left brain, right brain thinking style research. And it comes from some research that is about 30 years old, done by Sperry out in California. And Sperry, in his research, who had surgically split brains, the brains had been scanned for epilepsy. But in his research and ways of thinking and learning, the brain. And it came to be called thinking style, right brain thinking style. Now, having said that, and the fact that it's used a lot in education and other areas, I also have to say this is a major oversimplification, because in real life, all of us use all of our brain all the time, right? It's an interactive process. Well, I know there are people in their brain any of the time, but other than that, it's an interactive process. And in left brain, right brain thinking styles may only be a metaphor for styles of thinking that doesn't have a real good physiological correlation. But nonetheless, it turns out to be terribly important for understanding social and emotional needs of gifted kids. So bear with me a little bit on this side trip. As kids with a left brain thinking style are highly verbal. They're sequential thinkers. It's one task at a time. They're analytical, orderly, concrete, structured, a place, everything in its place type of mentality. They like proper working materials and proper settings to work into. They're oriented toward facts, details, and very serious about all of this. And it's quite a different style than the so-called right brain thinking style, where instead of being serious, they're pretty playful, almost whimsical. It's hard sometimes to get them to take something seriously. And facts and details, they almost can't be bothered because they want the overview, the big picture. Proper working materials? No way. Right brain thinking style people like to improvise. Even if they do have proper working materials, they want to try it a different way. Concrete, structured, not a chance. Because right-brainers like the abstract, fluid, open, go with the flow, innovative experiences. And part of why they like to do this, right-brainers like to do this, is because right-brainers use a different kind of logic than the left-brain thinking style. Left-brain thinking style uses deductive logic. They take a principle and deduce the logical implications from it. Very structured, very orderly. Right brain, they use inductive logic. They take a bunch of scattered experiences, synthesize them, pull them together, and induce an overarching principle, a new way of looking at it. This very easily because whereas the left brainers have one task, multiprocessors. Kid, because at any point in time, they have from stages of incompletion at any time, any of them to closure. And their rooms are almost always disaster, as are their backpacks and their desks. And in this is that left-brainers learn verbally, much more visually, or by doing things. So why I wanted to start with this overhead was that partly to let you know that I'm talking to you left-brainers and showing pictures to you right-brainers with the overhead. And knowing that I'm saying that only somewhat tongue-in-cheek, because I know with audiences that as you go through this list, most people can identify themselves as being primarily a left-brainer or primarily a right-brainer. Could you not? Now, some people are really balanced, but most people have a pretty clear preferred style. They can kick in the other one when they need to, but they have a preferred style. By the way, which is better to be, a left-brainer or a right-brainer in terms of thinking? I hear right brain. Someone says right-brainers have more fun. But left-brainers are more organized. And of course, that's really kind of a trick question because the answer to that is in return of which is better for what? In my incorporation papers, I'm not looking for a right-brained attorney. I'm looking for someone who's concrete, sequential, verbal, detailed, precise, going to get it done on time, follow the formula. Okay. But if I want someone to creatively design an architectural structure, or someone to innovatively do a painting, I don't want someone who's going to come and paint by the numbers. I want someone who's going to push the envelope, right? Which makes more of a contribution to society? A Frank Lloyd Wright type architect or a corporation attorney? Well, they both do. You see what I'm saying? Yeah. It's okay. Now, I'm going to come back and pick up on this in just a minute. I'm saying that for you left-brainers here who need closure. You right-brainers would kind of hang with me on this. But you left-brainers, I will come back to this and say a little bit more about why this is so important for social and emotional needs of gifted kids. I started out with these characteristics, the consensus characteristics, but now I want to depart from that and go down to, frankly, how our schools in our country typically identify gifted children. They typically focus on not all that laundry list of characteristics, but instead focus on the intellect. Intellectual achievement, intellectual ability and achievement levels. In a way, well, it's been called a multi-factored approach. 4, 5, 6, maybe even 7 different ways of getting information about them. One is teacher nomination. 2 is group test scores. 3 would be parent nominations, maybe self-nomination, maybe peer nomination. Some places have what they call portfolio assessment. But frankly, when I have looked around the country, the ones that I find repeatedly emerging as the most powerful out of those 7 are teacher nomination, grades, and group test scores. Why I'm highlighting this is that the research indicates that under ordinary circumstances, teacher nomination fails to identify half of our gifted kids, and that group tests and grades fail to identify about half of our gifted children. And the half that I think that we're failing to identify are primarily our right-brained gifted kids. Now think about that for a minute. I mean, group tests. I've got a bunch of 3rd graders sitting together taking a paper and pencil, verbally mediated, logical, sequential, detail recall. That's left brain, right? Teacher nomination. Which kind of kid is more likely to be pleasing to have in the classroom? The sort of kid who wants to be real creative with your lesson plan? Or comes in with his own lesson plan in mind? No. It's the sort of kid who can and will fit into the system as the system thinks. What I'm saying then is, folks, our right brain gifted children are less likely to be identified and therefore more likely to be at risk for several problems. Now, not that our left brainers are without risk. Our left brainers are more at risk for perfectionism, and we'll say more about that in a minute. But our right brain gifted kids are more at risk for not being identified, for underachievement, for getting in power struggles. And as a matter of fact, let me give you a recipe for a power struggle. So you can go home and have one if you want. Many of you already have them, I know, but this is a recipe. A very bright, intense, sensitive, right-brained, creative youngster with a caring, intense, left-brain parent, particularly a father. Now, the irony of this is the more the father or the parent cares, the more likely the power struggle. And they have these incredible conversations that go like this. Young lady, I can't believe you forgot your homework 3 times this week. When I was your age, young lady, I would have died to have opportunities like you. I had to walk 80 miles both ways uphill or whatever. And then I usually go on to talk about your room and this organization and so forth, so forth. It's totally a different style. Now, remember, it's kind of like, you know, I talked about left brain, right brain thinking styles, and they'd had an impact on families as well. It amazes me how often left brainers tend to marry right brainers. Have you noticed that? It's stunning. And then, I mean, it's a shock. From here to the airport, you know, you go out, you take a left, you go 1.28 miles, you take a left. Remember where that big fire was last year? We saw the, isn't it right? Different style. But with our kids, We can laugh about it with ourselves, but with our kids, do you see? But remember now, folks, we've said inherently there's nothing better about being a right brainer or a left brainer, haven't we? I want you to keep that in mind when you go home tonight. And actually, I want you to keep something else in mind. I'm assuming that most of you are here because you have a child who's been identified as gifted, and most likely that's a left-brain child. So I want you to go home and look and see if maybe you don't have another child who is equally gifted but just right-brained and divergent thinking. So go home and look. That is, if you have other kids. If you don't have other kids, don't bother looking. But if you do have other kids, go home and take a look and see and begin to think and talk about this within the family. Now, I do have to tell you, though, that there is not any one test that will measure all aspects of giftedness. The ways that we try to measure these abilities and talents and potentials, they're okay, but they're not perfect, which is why we need that parent-teacher partnership to share information as much as possible. Okay, but having said that, now what I want to do is to further distill and oversimplify matters to make some key points that will, I think, help you understand the social and emotional needs of gifted kids. I want to simplify it down to talking about gift of IQ. Now, please, folks, hear that as an open. I am not saying IQ is the end-all and be-all and measures everything about giftedness. I'm using it because everyone in our society knows IQ scores and knows that it has this nice, smooth curve that anytime you try abilities, you get that normal distribution. Me to make some key points. Perhaps let me point out some basic aspects here that everyone knows you have this fundamentally normal distribution, and here's the average range where 2/3 of the population falls. Up here is the area that's referred to as gifted. In IQ terms, most often it's 130. Most often, but not universally. Some places say instead of defining gifted as the upper 3%, we're going to call it the upper 5%. A few even say, a few states like Kentucky and South have said we're going to define gifted as the upper 7%. That we call gifted, it's kind of an arbitrary draw your line. But most places say the upper 3%. So I'm going to talk in terms of that. The other thing that strikes me about this when I talk about 3% is how small a percentage that is. And that what we're talking about with gifted children is the upper 3% being in a population that's really designed primarily around the average, particularly we design our curriculum in most places around the average child. Well, actually now thinking about how we've designed our curriculum about the below average child. We've dumbed down our curriculum. And we've tightly organized our curriculum in most public school settings and have in fact mainstreamed kids from the other end of the intellectual. That jumps out at me is yes, 3% is a small percentage, but yet it's the same percentage as down here on the other end of the intellectual spectrum. The ones down here that we call mentally retarded. And then an interesting thing comes out for me, and that is, as professionals, parents, educate more about kids on the lower end of the intellectual spectrum. Also, it's terribly important. The yubbuts. You know, yeah, but what could be a problem with a gifted child? Because those are the yubbuts, you hear it, right? I mean, after all, these kids learn things more quickly, they retain information longer. What on earth could be a problem for a gifted child? Well, folks, let me tell you, The research indicates very clearly that for gifted kids in the regular classroom, from 1/2 to 1/4 of the regular classroom time is spent waiting for others to catch up. That gifted kids, on the average, are underachieving by 2 to 4 grade levels below what they could comfortably achieve at. Boredom is rampant. Peer relation problems are almost universal. Perfectionism, about 20% of gifted kids are handicapped with not very, very frequent. And these kids are more prone to certain kinds of depression. There's one kind that I think they're uniquely prone to. It's called existential depression. It's one that you'll see in these youngsters in junior high or high school or as young adults. And part of that leads to the studies that have been probably the most bothersome to me, the ones that have looked at highly achieving, gifted college students and found that ones who are highly achieving, and that's what we want them to do, and they're in college, with a sense of suicide amongst those the college students. What this says to me is that there clearly are some myths about gifted kids. There are really about 3 basic. The first one being gifted children don't need any special help, they'll make it on their own. Well, it depends. Or you'll hear variations on rises to the top. You've heard that? I never was convinced by that. Most gifted children are a joy to have in the family. Parents tell me these kids often are a real pain in the elbow to have when you have a 9-year-old Philadelphia lawyer or the like. And then the third most prevalent myth is gifted children love to be the examples in the class and to be held up as the ones for everyone else to emulate. That gets old real quickly. Actually, these myths, folks, and if you took nothing else home from tonight, this is what I would want you to take home, because this sets the framework within which we have to understand everything about the gifted child's functioning throughout their lifetime. And that is, our society is fundamentally ambivalent about gifted children and gifted education. Now let me tell you what I mean by that. Think with me. If you remember what the leaders of our society have said for decades, haven't they said, Lord knows we need our brightest minds, they're our nation's greatest resource. Isn't that right? Then they go on to describe this incredible array of outer space exploration, AIDS epidemics, balance of payments problems, the computer revolution that we have, the have and have-nots in our own society, the terrorism epidemic that we have, the nuclear proliferation, the environmental concerns, the list goes on. We need our brightest, most creative minds. Isn't that what they say? But folks, what a society values, a society supports. And when I look at the support for gifted education, it's not. Instead, is that gifted education is supported rarely, occasionally, and to a far lesser degree than any other category of acceptance. Said these kids are fundamentally as different, and they have